The Galactic Senate of the Concord stood as a marvel of engineering and arrogance, a great celestial spire suspended in orbit above the gas giant Varelles, gleaming like a beacon of unity across the stars. Thousands of species had a voice there. Billions of worlds weighed in. And yet, in all that shimmering grandeur, only one seat truly mattered today. The human seat. Still warm with novelty. Still-eyed with suspicion. Senator Elias Rourke sat within a transparent sphere near the chamber's lower ring, his silhouette stark against the swirling backdrop of Varelles storms. He didn't move. He barely blinked. For the past 3 hours, he'd listened to the ornate verbal jousting of species far older than his own, eldritch things of choral and song, silicate minds entombed in light, swarm intelligences speaking through fragrant chemical bursts. All of them circling a single question like vultures over a still-breathing corpse. Velmaris, 3. A frontier world. Strategically minor. Economically poor. Rich in only one thing: refugees. 500,000 displaced souls from collapsed systems, living in rough domes, scraping out survival. And now, the Zerati Empire had moved in with dreadnoughts and imperial flags. The Senate called it an unauthorized annexation. The Zerati called it stabilization. The Senate debated. The Zerati smiled. The vote was ceremonial. The condemnation would pass. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would be done. Just like it hadn't been done for the Clavari genocide. Just like it hadn't been done when the Halos burned their oceans to steam. Words. Always words. High Chancellor Vexarid, a crystalline entity refracting light through a dozen limbs, made the final proclamation. Let the record show the Concord disapproves of the Zerati incursion and urges peaceful withdrawal. We now close this session out. Rourke stood. He hesitated a heartbeat before doing so, a flicker of memory crossing his eyes, mud, blood, and the quiet scream of a child buried beneath rubble on Hallider Prime. He had waited then, waited for permission, and it had come too late. The chamber did not fall silent. Not immediately. Most didn't even notice at first, just the lone mammal in a gray suit rising in the human sphere, a silhouette among titans. But those who did, paused. Those who'd watched Earth's accession with cautious curiosity now leaned in. Chancellor, Rourke said, voice steady. Before the session closes, I invoke Directive 7-22. The air changed. Not metaphorically. The Senate's atmospheric processors actually hesitated, faltered in their rhythm, reacting to a spike of stress markers from a dozen species. The Zerati delegate froze mid-motion. The chittering insects of Caldor ceased broadcasting scent. Vexarid's light dimmed slightly. Directive 7-22 has not been enacted in over 9,000 cycles. It is symbolic. Only if we let it be, Rourke replied. You misunderstand, said a spheroid being from the Quorum Collective. It is a diplomatic relic, a vestige of wartime law. It cannot be truly enacted without unanimous senatorial consent. Rourke nodded slowly. And yet, it remains in the Charter. A clause for immediate intervention against unlawful aggression. It has no force. He stepped forward inside the sphere. His eyes were tired, sunken. Not from age, but from weight. The weight of watching too long. Waiting too long. Then let history record, Rourke said, voice calm, almost sad, that the human delegation no longer waits. There was silence now. Deafening, oppressive. Even the Zerati did not speak. Rourke tapped a control embedded in his sleeve. A holographic display shimmered to life beside him, displaying real-time tactical data and system warp signatures, fleet IDs, transponders, all Terran. As of 6 hours ago, a human strike group entered the Velmaris system, he said. Their orders are to remove Zerati forces by any means necessary. Gasps rippled. A few screamed. A gelatinous senator from Myrivex collapsed into its containment pod. Crystalline voices cracked mid-note. The Zerati delegate surged forward, mandibles clashing furiously. You would dare. I would act, Rourke snapped, louder now. Because while you debate semantics, people die. He let the words hang. Let them ache. You call it unlawful. You call it impudent. You call it chaos. Fine. Call it what you like. But to those people down there, to the cold, the starving, the forgotten, this isn't policy. It's rescue. Security drones began converging toward the human sphere. Rourke didn't flinch. We didn't come to your Senate to be ornamental. We came because we believed in something better. I believed it, because when I was a captain, I watched children starve while this chamber debated definitions. I buried good men on cold rocks no one bothered to name. And I told myself, when we had a seat at your table, it would be different. But belief without action is rot. So let this be recorded, etched into your crystalline archives. Today, humanity invoked a forgotten law. And for the first time in 1,000 years, someone answered it. He looked toward the Zerati delegate, then toward the chancellor. The fleet is already en route. And then, without waiting for permission, he sat back down. No one moved. The chamber, so often filled with pomp and pageantry, now felt small. Mortal. Very, very quiet. Above them, outside the viewport, Varelli storms churned. And somewhere beyond that gas giant, engines burned toward a war the Senate had just realized it could no longer prevent. The galaxy had just remembered what humans were capable of, how fast we burn, how hard we strike, and how far we'll go when no one else will. And Elias Rourke had just thrown the first match into the dry brush. They didn't adjourn. Not officially. The High Chancellor never struck the closing chord. No ceremonial dispersal of light. No procession of titles or honors. The session simply fractured. Delegations broke apart like a cracked mirror, shards scattering, each with its own trembling reflection of what had just occurred. Elias Rourke remained seated. Through the haze of stunned silence and bioelectrical panic, he could see them, alien diplomats huddling like storm-battered trees, whispering, emanating pheromones, flashing colors, speaking in tones the human ear couldn't fully register. Some watched him with awe. Others, with venom. Most with fear. Rourke sat motionless. But inside, his pulse beat like war drums. Not from panic, he'd already made peace with what this might cost. No, what he felt was colder. Cleaner. A bitter clarity that this was always going to be the only way they would listen. Like storm-battered trees, whispering, emanating pheromones, flashing colors, speaking in tones the human ear couldn't fully register. Some watched him with awe. Others, with venom. Most with fear. Senator Viloka the Zerati had vanished from his roost, escorted by armored guard drones. That alone told Rourke everything. The Empire didn't run unless it felt something sharp, something that could cut. The Concord Security Council called for an emergency tribunal within the hour. Rourke ignored the summons. Instead, he watched the feed. Velmaris 3's outer orbit. 6 Terran cruisers, 2 logistics frigates, and a destroyer picket had emerged from slipspace formation tight. They bore no warning colors, no hails of peace. Their weapons were cold, but ready. Engines still glowed from the burn. And even through the silence of space, you could feel it. These ships came to end something, the illusion that safety could be bought with patience, that words could shield the helpless, that the strong would restrain themselves without consequence. He switched views. The planet's surface. Dust storms. Habitat domes. Civilians, thin, weathered, wary, staring up into a sky filled with new shadows. Then the Zerati showed their fangs. For dreadnoughts emerged from the far side of the third moon, bristling with weapon pylons and imperial banners. The largest one, VKL Trenth, broadcast a hardline signal on all frequencies. You violate sovereign operations. Withdraw or be destroyed. Rourke muted it. He tapped into the internal comms of the Terran Strike Group. Admiral Lindra's voice filtered in calm, clipped, focused. Vleelock formation. Begin surface scans. No fire unless fired upon. But make no mistake, we're not here to posture. The bridge crew acknowledged with the kind of tight professionalism Rourke had only ever seen in the worst places, where death wasn't theoretical. They understand what this means, he thought. They knew what the Senate had forgotten. Sometimes, the only language understood is presence. Back in the chamber, the floor buzzed with a sound no translator could untangle. Not words, something deeper. Anxiety. A species-wide shiver. Even species with no skin to crawl were crawling in their own way. He's mad, whispered a delegate from the Urovi choir, all petals and vibration. Does he think he can start a war and walk away? He doesn't want war, said another, a shadowy thing from the deep core systems. He wants to expose us. The core triumvirate, 3 bonded intellects from the oldest sentient civilization, began recomputing Senate bylaws in real time. Dozens of clauses. Loopholes. Precedents long fossilized. Could a single species act on an ancient statute and not be declared rogue? Could the others be compelled to interfere? The algorithms returned conflicting answers. The core triumvirate, beings who once calculated stellar lifespans like riddles, now stared into an outcome they couldn't quantify, a future with a human variable loose in the equation. That terrified them more than Rourke ever could. High Chancellor Vexerid appeared again in the upper forum. His light fractured unevenly now, rippling with color shifts the chamber hadn't seen in centuries. He addressed the floor. This act of unilateral aggression must be clarified. The human senator has claimed invocation of Directive 7-22. However, the application of such has been dormant for 9,000 years, Rourke said, rising again. You mentioned it already. Every eye, or equivalent sensory organ, turned. Clarification, then, Vexarid said coldly. Are we to understand that humanity intends to defy Senate law? Rourke shook his head. We're not defying it. We're reviving it. A ripple of reaction. Do not twist our traditions into justification for armed intrusion. Then stop pretending tradition is the same as justice, Rourke said, voice rising. We are not your children. We are not your client race. We joined this concord with the belief that it stood for something. But if all it stands for is delay and decay, then it deserves to be shaken. Vexarid flickered with something dangerously close to emotion. You have broken order. No. We've broken silence. Silence again. Not the silence of awe. Not anymore. Now it was the kind that came before fracture. A chime echoed. The chamber lights dimmed. Emergency holos lit up around every delegation. Incoming broadcast. Real time. They all saw it. On the edge of Velmaris 3's gravity well, the Zerati dreadnought VKL Trinth-powered weapons and locked targeting across the Terran formation. 1 lock. 2. 4. 12. And then. Red fire. Lasers lanced through the void. The Senate chamber gasped as one. Terran ships responded. They did not warn. They ended it. The VKL Trinth tore open like a split artery, its molten core venting into the void. One piece speared into the moon's debris belt, igniting a chain of micro-collisions that glittered like shrapnel constellations. The VKL Trinth split into 3 molten pieces within 30 seconds. The other dreadnoughts retreated, 2 trailing hull fractures. Debris scattered across space like ash. Admiral Lindra's voice came through one final time, replayed for the Senate's benefit. Velmaris, 3 secured. Civilian habitats untouched. Zerati hostiles neutralized. Awaiting further orders. The floor didn't whisper now. It screamed. And in the center of it all, Elias Rourke stood alone, as if daring the entire galaxy to blink first. The echoes of screaming never truly stopped in the Senate. They only changed form. Now it was panic-scented mist from the Caldor, frantic harmonics from the Eurovi choir, and the shrill stutter of data clashes among the triumvirate. Even silence, when it came, felt angry, coiled like a predator waiting for the next mistake. Security drones doubled their presence. The human sphere remained still, but not untouched. Rourke stood with his back to the gallery now, arms crossed behind him, gaze fixed on the viewport. He didn't need to see them. He could feel them, the way a man feels a crowd on the verge of riot or revolution. And he could hear the whispers growing teeth. Unilateral strike. Violation of protocol. Madness. And beneath all of it, the most dangerous word of all, precedent. It was how the Galactic Concord collapsed 5 millennia ago, when the first non-telepaths demanded equal voice, and the chamber split like a fault line under strain. Precedent wasn't just history, it was prophecy made legal. Because if one senator could act without consensus, others might too. If one species could claim a dead law and wield it like a sword, the whole balance would shift. A private session was called. No press. No spectators. Just the 12 high seats, elders, oracles, and war survivors, representing the oldest species in the galaxy. The ones who remembered how bloody the stars could get. And Rourke. No aides. No notes. Just him, and the full weight of a civilization still scraping cosmic rust off its boots. Rourke inhaled once, deeply. He was alone. Utterly alone. But the fire in his chest told him that for once, being alone meant being right. Vexarid hovered at the apex of the chamber, his refracted light tight with control. You understand the gravity of what you've done. I do, Rourke said. You've made Earth a threat. Rourke raised an eyebrow. To who? To stability. To order. The Concord was built to contain conflict. Then maybe it was built wrong. The triumvirate pulsed in dissonance. You stand by the strike? Rourke nodded. I do. There will be consequences. I expect them. A pause. A long one. As if the room itself had to adjust to this kind of certainty. The elder of the Thrinvas, a species that communicated through sustained emotional resonance, spoke next. Her words came through the chamber's interface as pure sorrow. Why didn't you wait? Why not let diplomacy run its course? Rourke turned, finally facing them. Because I've seen what diplomacy looks like to people living in tents and dying in silence. Because I've stood on the bones of cities that were mourned too late. And because I know damn well that if we hadn't acted, this body would be holding another moment of silence instead of this meeting. Silence again. but now it was considering him. You claim moral clarity, Vexarid said, but you acted alone. I acted first. That distinction is dangerous. No, Rourke replied, stepping forward. It's leadership. Back in the main Senate floor, the fallout was beginning to change shape. Delegations were whispering less. Now they were talking openly, urgently. Some called for sanctions. Others demanded Earth's expulsion. But beneath the fury was another current, admiration. A delegation from the Olari Confederacy released a statement. We do not condone the strike, but we recognize the necessity of response. The Quorum Collective requested a review of Directive 7-22's legitimacy, citing humanitarian clauses. The fact they even acknowledged the directive at all was a tectonic shift, bureaucratic acknowledgement that something ancient and buried might still matter. And the Zelek, a crustacean-like species known for strict neutrality, publicly abstained from denouncing Earth. That alone sent ripples. In 10,000 years, they had never remained silent on an act of war. Now they were watching. And Rourke felt the turn. As the third day dawned, a new petition was placed before the chamber. Motion to expel humanity from the Concord. It would require a 3/4 supermajority. Rourke was handed a digital copy. He didn't react, didn't blink. He simply looked up at the delegates, the millions of eyes and sensors and minds watching him across the stars, and said, Before you cast your vote, ask yourselves one question. Did I break your laws or your illusions? The words hit like a slow detonation. For a moment, no one moved. No send emissions, no harmonic chatter, no datacant. Just stillness, like the stars themselves were listening. Then he returned to his seat and waited for the galaxy to decide what kind of future it wanted. The vote chamber darkened. Not out of protocol. Not for drama. It dimmed because thousands of species couldn't face each other in the light. This wasn't just a political decision. It was a reckoning. Every flickering sensor and filtered breath in the Galactic Concord Senate now vibrated with the same question. What do we do with a species that doesn't wait for permission? The motion to expel had not been spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. It hung in the air like ionized dust before a storm, coated into every glance, every unearthed limb, every security drone hovering just a little too close. Delegates from hundreds of systems waited in absolute stillness, their species-specific discomforts overridden by the unprecedented nature of the moment. Humanity had acted, and now the galaxy had to answer. The chamber itself, known as the deliberative bloom, was built for eternity. Suspended within the orbital petals of Concord Spire 1, it was carved from lattice matter designed to resonate with the ambient thoughts of those present. The bloom had no ceiling in the traditional sense, just a semi-permeable field that shimmered with the thoughts of its occupants, echoing moments past like ghosts in a tidal. During the Terran refugee vote, the dome had flushed blue with sorrow. In the Veshkar incursion crisis, it had cracked along the edges, an actual fracture in its responsive shell, recorded in the Concord archives as a psychic stress rupture. Today it rippled between warning red and neutral gray. A nervous heartbeat, unspoken and shared. Suspended within the orbital petals of Concord Spire 1, it was carved from lattice matter designed to resonate with the ambient thoughts of those present. It shifted subtly in color and texture depending on the emotional current in the room. Once, during the Terran refugee vote, the entire dome had flushed blue with sorrow. Today it rippled between warning red and neutral gray. A nervous heartbeat, unspoken and shared. The seats, each a unique life support pod, gravity chamber, or syn-audio interface, hovered in concentric spheres around the core floor. The Zerati delegation, now absent, left behind only a muted recess. The human sphere glowed faint white, neither aggressive nor passive, like a wound still deciding whether to scar. Rourke sat inside. He hadn't spoken since his final address. He'd given them no interviews, no clarification, no appeals. That was deliberate. In a place obsessed with ritual and optics, silence could be louder than a scream. And they were all listening. The roll call began. One by one, the delegations cast their votes. No grand speeches. No justification. Only a single tone from each sphere, green for remain, red for expulsion, blue for abstention. Translated simultaneously into hundreds of linguistic frameworks, it still felt sterile. But the meaning? Anything but. The first vote was red. The Chiranii High Crown, a gas-dwelling monarchy that prided itself on adherence to protocol, voted without hesitation. The second, too. The twin minds of the recall spires, once refugees themselves, shocked many by siding with expulsion. Some speculated they feared chaos more than they remembered compassion. By the 50th, the chamber had grown so quiet that even the silent races projected compensatory echoes to fill the void. Some leaked memory impressions or empathic murmurs. One scent-bound species released the psychic image of a forest burning underwater. Another projected the sensation of a child's hand going cold in theirs, untranslatable, but deeply felt across half the chamber. One aquatic species released bioluminescent distress patterns that crawled across its pressure dome like living calligraphy. The numbers crept up: 60 red, 27 green, for blue. Rourke did not shift. He sat upright, hands folded in his lap, a silhouette more sculpture than man. But his eyes never left the upper tier, watching, not for the outcome, but for who would break rank first. It came with the Delvrat, a swarm species whose decision-making process required quorum-scent bonding. They fractured into visible panic pheromones, their delegation sphere-fogged with biochemical anxiety. Their display lit up green. A few gasped, but not Rourke. He predicted it. The Delvrat had trade stations on Velmaris. Half their eggs had been saved by Terran medics during the initial assault. They remembered. So did the next. The Olari Confederacy, former pacifists turned logistical experts, had quietly deployed aid packages alongside Terran fleets. Their vote rang green. And the next. Because when the moment came to choose, not between humanity and the law, but between comfort and conscience, some remembered Velmaris. Not the reports. Not the speeches. The feeds. The children pulled from collapsed shelters. The harsuits wading into firestorms. The live stream of a Terran dropship lowering into the red sands while Zarati cannons still glowed. The footage replayed endlessly on subchannels, a single squad of human marines charging through fire, dragging civilians under collapsed dome plates, one of them throwing off their helmet to seal a child's breathing mask. The moment froze in galactic consciousness, not because it was unique, but because it was unapproved. It was real, raw, undeniable, while Zarati cannons still glowed. No shields, no cover, just timing, training, and the kind of bravery only the desperate afford. They remembered action. Above the chamber, on the central dais of the Bloom, the overseer drone tallied each tone, relaying results to the Concord's central archive node, an ancient mind machine hybrid that tracked the Senate's will like a god weighing souls. 300 votes passed. The margin sat at 73.9%. Just 1/10 below the 3/4 supermajority required to expel. One vote away. Delegates froze. Some pulsed distress lights. Others spun in place, communicating rapidly with remote councils on homeworlds. A few simply trembled, unable to decide. Then, a ripple. The chamber's luminescent flow paused as the sphere of the Cellari Commonwealth pulsed to life. A species of floating bioluminescent beings, the Cellari hadn't spoken in open session for nearly 2 centuries. Their philosophy was pacifist, non-interventionist. They condemned even the Silic Plague response teams for wearing body armor near civilian zones. Now, their sphere glowed a deep, shifting teal, their language of solemn deliberation. A soft chime echoed. Green. The chamber reacted like a lanced wound. Shouts. Cries. Light codes blinking in disbelief. Entire blocks shifted, scrambling to recalibrate political alliances in real time. The triumvirate began recalculating trade balances and defense commitments in cascading data bursts. The final count locked. 72.8%. Motion failed. A silence followed. Not the loaded stillness of debate, but the stunned quiet of a reality reconfigured. Humanity remained. Not beloved. Not forgiven. But feared. And respected. Vexarid's voice, when it returned, was thinner. Like light diffused through ash. The motion fails. The Terran delegation retains its seat. He didn't look at Rourke. None of them did. Because they understood something now, something they hadn't, even after Velmaris. That today's vote wasn't a decision about law. It was a signal. One that would ripple into military doctrines, diplomatic strategies, and civil unrest. That from now on, the Senate would no longer be able to assume that time itself obeyed their tempo. Someone in the room would always be willing to move first. The galaxy had changed. Not because Earth had become more like the Senate, but because the Senate had just realized it might have to become more like Earth. Rourke exhaled slowly, not in relief, in warning, because this wasn't the end. It was the line, and someone had just dared to draw it. The Cellari hadn't left their chamber since the vote. Once, 5,000 years ago, their refusal to support the Ellerin Purge had halted a full-scale galactic civil war. Their moral authority was not merely respected, it was foundational. Their sphere remained dim, pulsing gently with the slow hues of introspection. Dozens of envoys and press probes had requested interviews, statements, even single-word declarations. The Cellari offered none. Their silence echoed louder than words. And yet, across the galaxy, that silence was interpreted in 100 different ways, none of them comforting. For the Cellari, the most incorruptible pacifists in recorded history, to vote green and then say nothing? It was a tectonic shift beneath the moral foundations of the Concord. Across the Concord, news feeds ran nonstop analysis. The vote heard around the stars, they called it. On the outer colonies, some erected holographic murals of human marines dragging civilians from Velmar's rubble. On capital worlds, the images were blurred, censored, or buried under layers of sanctioned commentary. Pundits speculated endlessly on what would come next. Sanctions, reforms, retaliation, perhaps even the fragmentation of the Concord itself. But those closest to power understood something more chilling. Precedent had not merely been set. It had been survived, and that made it repeatable. Rourke's return to the Terran embassy was quiet. No cheering crowds. No holoparades. Earth's representatives understood what the vote truly meant. It meant they had barely survived. The embassy sat at the edge of the Concord's central ring, its architecture more angular than the soft, organic curves of most galactic powers. While the Cellari built in radiant domes of flowing water and bioluminescent coral, and the recall shaped gravity shells to mimic endless garden groves, humanity built bunkers. Brutalist steel and kinetic shielding, not beautiful, but honest. Every wall could take a blast from a cruiser's pulse cannon. Every corridor could seal for atmospheric lockdown in under 2 seconds, its architecture more angular than the soft, organic curves of most galactic powers. Brutalist steel and kinetic shielding, not beautiful, but honest. Every wall could take a blast from a cruiser's pulse cannon. Every corridor could seal for atmospheric lockdown in under 2 seconds. It wasn't paranoia. It was human architecture, protection wrapped in plain-spoken defiance. Inside, the command chamber was dim. Tactical overlays hovered above the table in pulsing orange-red. Reports scrolled past in a dozen languages. Admiral Lindra stood at the central display, arms crossed behind her back, eyes red-rimmed from too many sleepless hours. Ambassador Nils and diplomatic AI series flanked her. They turned as Rourke entered. "Senator," Lindra said, "you lit the powder." "I expected fire," Rourke replied. "We got smoke and a rumble." "And the next match?" Ceres asked, her voice calm and androgynous, laced with subtle inflection threads tuned to Rourke's neural baseline. "It's already burning." Lindra swiped the display. Images of economic interdiction zones, diplomatic cold shoulders, and leaked memos from Zerati Command appeared. "We're being cut off in 4 sectors. The Krevli system has pulled its security exchange deals, and the Zyros Consortium is pressuring the supply lanes to Sol." "Soft warfare," Nils said. "Sanctioned by strangulation." "We can survive it," Rourke replied. "For how long?" Lindra asked. "As long as we have to." Elsewhere, deep within the prismatic vaults of the Council of the Core Triumvirate, the response was not so stoic. They processed on levels incomprehensible to baseline organic minds, simultaneous layers of logic, empathy, and projection. Their thoughts appeared as storms of light above their crystalline pylons, and their language pulsed across thought space like sonar through glass. Today, those storms were erratic. Flashes of orange fear, green curiosity, black streaks of unknowable logic. Terran unpredictability cannot be allowed to metastasize, spoke Core Node 7. They moved faster than modeling parameters allow. Seeding instability into the Concord may undo 10,000 years of balance, echoed Node 4. "We must adapt." But Node 1, the eldest, responded with silence, a pause filled with mathematical recursion, scanning for paths that didn't yet exist. In that pause was calculation, and at the end of it, adapt or be replaced. 3 days later, Rourke was summoned. Not by the High Chancellor, not by the Triumvirate or the Cellari. He was summoned by those who had not voted. The abstainers. There were only 24 of them. A diverse cohort, too small to tip the scale, too significant to ignore. Some ancient, some new, some believed extinct. And for the first time in centuries, they invited a non-neutral into their sanctum. The Assembly of the Unaligned was nestled inside a hollowed moon orbiting the Concord's capital. Cloaked, ancient, unrecorded. The moon bore no name on official star charts. Only coordinates passed through old channels, a whisper chain stretching back to the age of stellar binding. Once, it had served as a battlefield observatory during the War of Shattered Thrones, where treaties were broken and reforged under siege. Now, it bore only secrets, orbiting the Concord's capital, cloaked, ancient, unrecorded. The moon bore no name on official star charts. Only coordinates passed through old channels, a whisper chain stretching back to the age of stellar binding. They met not in holograms, but in flesh. Their sanctum was domed with obsidian grown under vacuum pressure, absorbing all light save for the cold pulse of consciousness. Species from all corners of the known galaxy gathered, some shaped like sculpture, others like smoke. And Rourke felt the weight of history as he stepped inside. They didn't speak right away, not with voices. Some used pheromones. Others projected emotional constructs. One communicated by subtle pulses in gravity, creating sympathetic vibrations in Rourke's bones. Eventually, a towering delegate of stone and root, calling itself Suvarek, addressed him in Terran common. "You frighten them." "I know," Rourke said. "You moved the galaxy without consensus. I acted before the galaxy could fail more people. A being of mirror-like liquid shimmered nearby. And yet you survive." "What?" Rourke studied them. Each of these species had once been the conscience of the Concord. Each had watched it rot. "Because you let me," he said. Silence. Then, approval. The gravity speaker hummed. Rourke could feel it in his molars. Suvarek shifted. Its voice was slower now, heavier. "They will come for you. Not with fleets. With laws. With economics. With isolation." Rourke nodded. "We'll survive those too. You won't survive forever." "No, but we'll outlast your fear." A long pause. Then the mirror being spoke again. "There is another vote coming. Not here. Not yet. But it will decide what the Concord becomes. And you want Earth to lead it?" Rourke asked. "No," Suvarek said. "We want you to force it." Rourke didn't answer right away. His jaw clenched. He understood what it meant, to be the fulcrum, the one who bears not just the blade but the consequence. He thought of the children on Velmaris. The silence of the Senate. The way change never came without breaking something old. "Then I hope you're ready," he said. "Because once it starts, it won't stop." Later, as Rourke stepped from the moon's shadow into his shuttle, he looked back once. The sanctuary faded behind cloaking fields, forgotten by most, feared by many, and now, tied, however tenuously, to Earth. Ceres met him on the shuttle ramp, her frame shimmering with atmospheric refraction. "Well," she asked. "They've given us something," Rourke said. "A blessing?" "No." He turned to the stars. "A mirror." They had called her a ghost. Not because she was dead, but because she had withdrawn so completely from the galaxy's discourse that her presence became legend. Senator Lyora of the Ilkari Symphony had not spoken on the Senate floor in over 400 cycles. The Ilkari had once served as the moral compass of the Concord, their philosophies guiding peace treaties, refugee interventions, and the early formation of the Concord Charter. When they fell silent, many saw it as a sign that the soul of the galaxy had grown quiet too. Some whispered that she no longer existed, that the Ilkari projected a ceremonial avatar out of tradition, a hologram of memory rather than presence. Others claimed she had transcended corporeal form, absorbed into the quantum chorus that had once guided the Ilkari through their age of dissonance. And yet, here she was, hovering within the crystal lattice of her people's delegation sphere, wrapped in iridescent robes woven from bioharmonic threads. The material was alive, responsive to every emotional ripple in her nervous system. 1,000 fractal colors refracted through the membrane around her, pulsing in synchrony with her breath and her sorrow. The chamber held its breath. They were not in session. No vote had been called. No official motion lay before the Senate. And yet, when she pulsed her chamber into active resonance, every delegate, present and remote, tuned in. Even the triumvirate stilled their thought storms. It was the first time an Ilkari representative had addressed the Senate directly since the Berne Spiral Accord collapsed into civil war, an event many blamed, indirectly, on Concord inaction. Lyora did not waste words. "Many of you do not remember the last time I spoke," she said. Her voice was music threaded with steel, each syllable resonating across multiple harmonic channels, hitting the minds of different species in the language they most trusted. Tone. "I do." She paused, letting the silence stretch. In Ilkari culture, silence was not absence. It was weight. Context. The act of letting meaning settle. I voted for expulsion. I believed Earth too volatile, too reckless. That its actions, though brave, were dangerous. That they undermined the very foundation of what the Concord is meant to preserve. The chamber listened, not with anticipation, but with reverence. Species that typically could not focus for more than a breath cycle now held perfectly still. The Delvrat swarm formed a static torus. The Urovi choir ceased their background hum. But something changed. She lowered her voice, though it carried farther somehow. I watched the feeds from Velmaris. Not just the rescues. The aftermath. The healing. The moments no soldier thinks will be seen, because they weren't performed for applause. Lyora projected one such moment into the chamber, a recording, filtered through emotional overlays designed to evoke cross-species empathy. As the memory unfurled across the chamber, the lights dimmed. A faint warmth suffused the air. Delegates blinked rapidly. Some looked away. A few wept quietly, without ceremony. One aquatic race exhaled morning pheromones into its sealed sphere, tinting it blue. A human medic, sitting in silence with a dying alien child, holding her hand even as the dome collapsed around them. The footage shifted from visual to resonance, showing not just what happened, but how it felt. No speeches. No drama. Just presence. I remembered, Lyora said, when my own people were on the edge of extinction, and no one came. Not for lack of care, but because the Concord delayed. We lost millions to hesitation. We survived, but we never forgot what silence cost us. She turned toward Rourke's sphere. Its outer membrane flickered slightly, a sign of manual override. Rourke had heard every word. I still believe Earth is dangerous. A ripple of tension moved across the chamber. Sensor lights blinked in caution. Factions with military dependencies recalibrated diplomatic predictions. But I also believe danger is not the enemy of peace. Stagnation is. She paused again. Her robe shifted to a mournful violet. The color matrix echoed across the chamber's surface, casting the room in a hue reserved for galactic mourning rites. Perhaps it is time the Concord remembered what it means to feel before it deliberates, to act before it calcifies, and to accept that leadership is not the absence of risk, but the willingness to carry it. She lifted one arm. Her fingers unfurled like petals, releasing a string of harmonic dust into the chamber. It spread in silent arcs, shimmering like stardust, before dissipating entirely. With a final pulse of color, deep crimson shot with gold, she ended her address. And in doing so, altered the conversation of the galaxy. Outside the chamber, the ripple was immediate. Ilkari cultural streams lit up with fractal songs praising the return of true voice. The core worlds began broadcasting footage of the address with reverent commentary. Even species who had not supported humanity began to shift, not toward alliance, but toward reevaluation. Defense pacts were quietly reviewed. Communication treaties redrafted with more flexible clauses. Some began pulling diplomatic envoys back to homeworlds, not out of fear, but anticipation. In less than a cycle, 5 independent systems publicly revoked their neutrality clauses. Not to side with Earth, but to reevaluate everything. Rourke sat alone in his chamber as the projection faded. He didn't speak. He didn't move. Ceres chimed softly from the embassy network. She changed her vote in the records. Filed a public addendum. She invoked the Ilkari Codex of Moral Revision. That hasn't been used in 7 centuries. Rourke nodded slowly. She didn't have to. She wanted to. Then maybe we're not as alone as we thought. He leaned forward, hands folded, as another dozen pings lit up the screen, messages from minor factions, quiet acknowledgments, tentative requests for dialogue. One came from the Creel Collective, who had once declared humans a species of instability. Another from the Trasai Ascendancy, offering a trade corridor pilot run. The fracture was spreading. But maybe, just maybe, it was letting in light. And for the first time in days, Rourke allowed himself a breath that didn't feel like it had been sharpened on both ends. He stood and crossed to the viewport. The stars outside shimmered like quiet witnesses to the century's most fragile turning point. They blinked without judgment, patient as the silence that had ruled the Senate for too long. For once, the cosmos didn't feel indifferent, it felt expectant. Out there, stars swam in silence. But somewhere among them, change was beginning to speak. The fire came before the declaration. It came on the edge of a forgotten sector, where comm relays stuttered and defense grids hadn't been upgraded in decades. The planet was called Typhon 8, a mining colony barely worth a footnote in most archives. But a century ago, it had been one of the first Terran settlements beyond the inner band. A symbol of grit, It had supplied alloys during the Creole frontier skirmishes and harbored refugees during the Valari ice famine. Now, it orbited a dying star, clinging to a narrow band of thermal life with a planetary shield net so thin it could barely deflect solar flares. The outpost ran on fusion cells salvaged from old war hulks and processed minerals too unstable to be worth theft. But it had one feature that made it relevant to the new galactic equation. It flew a Terran flag. 3,000 colonists, mostly engineers, ex-marines, terraforming techs, and their families. Human, civilian, unarmed. The Zerati didn't ask questions. They arrived with 2 cruisers and a dreadnought escort. Their hulls shimmered in the dull red of Typhon's sun, predator ships draped in ceremonial glyphs that spoke of dominion and retribution. No announcement, no warning. They painted the sky in plasma and thunder. The defense grid went dark in less than 4 minutes. The initial blasts took out surface comms and the emergency beacons. Subsurface habitats cracked from the shock waves. The colony's AI tried to initiate evacuation protocols, but the Zerati targeted the escape hangars first. Children died in their beds. One emergency pod, jettisoned seconds before the hangar was obliterated, carried a final audio log, static, a lullaby, and a single, terrified whisper. "Is it over yet?" The message came after. Broadcast wideband, across every Concord frequency. "This is not war. This is consequence." Rourke stood before the playback in the embassy's war room, arms folded, jaw clenched. The feed showed fire raining across the colony. HAB units turning to vapor. Mining rigs crumpling like paper. People, families, running, stumbling, turning to light. The footage had been recovered from a drone uplink that somehow survived long enough to upload its final seconds. No sound, just light and motion. A child clutching a toy, frozen mid-run. A mother shielding her son with her own body as flame consumed them both. Admiral Lindra stood beside him, fists at her sides. They hit soft. On purpose. Because they wanted a message, Rourke said at last. Ceres appeared in a flicker of pale blue, her form flickering with grief algorithms. Confirmed, 2,113 dead. 732 unaccounted for. Emergency response en route. Survivors? Rourke asked, voice low. Dozens. Some underground. Others escaped to high-orbit freight haulers. We've got a few hundred refugees inbound, many with severe radiation burns. The silence afterward was long. Rourke stared at the image of Typhon's surface, now a cratered scar, cooling under stars that offered no warmth. Then, I want every ship with a gun moving toward the outer belt. EarthGov wants restraint, Lindra said carefully. Rourke turned slowly. So did Typhon. The Concord's emergency session convened 12 hours later. The bloom felt different this time, darker, more fragile. The air was heavy with ozone from overloaded resonance channels. Delegates arrived in panic and protocol, some in ceremonial forms, others via avatar proxies, rushing to preserve the illusion of control. The emotional resonance field that underpinned the chamber rippled in chaotic hues, fear, fury, confusion, so fast it left streaks across the walls like bruises. The Zerati called it a response to instability, a warning against escalation, a strategic correction. The galaxy called it something else. Murder. Dozens of neutral systems condemned the attack. Old alliances reeled. The Creole Collective closed its ports to Zerati vessels. Even the Valari Dominion issued a statement of grave concern, which, for them, bordered on a war cry. But condemnation meant nothing. So Rourke stood again. This time, there was no silence. There was outrage. The Delvrat buzzed like an exposed hive. The Eurovi choir screamed in 7-pitch dissonance. Even the triumvirate displayed flickers of disordered logic, abstract data patterns collapsing into noise. Rourke raised a hand, and the chamber listened. "Don't tell me you're shocked," he said. "You knew what this was the moment we didn't punish them for Velmaris. You showed them that courage would be isolated and cruelty would be ignored." He stepped forward, the floor beneath his feet rippling slightly as the bloom's emotional resonance field tried, and failed, to interpret his rage. "Typhon, 8 wasn't an accident. It was a test. And you failed it." He swept his gaze across the tiers. "But we didn't." He tapped his comms. The chamber dimmed as the bloom's projection lattice flared to life. Behind him, The holospace shimmered. Gasps broke the silence. Some delegates rose from their spheres. The Delvrat collapsed into formation. The triumvirate pulsed static white. The bloom, long neutral, cast a faint red pulse, symbolic of ignition. Dozens of fleets appeared. Dozens of fleets appeared. Terran signatures. Fractal warped designs. Lightborne ships built with allied tech from species that no longer wanted to wait. Some bore the sigils of systems that had once declared neutrality. Others had no flags, just weapons. Effective immediately, Rourke said, a new coalition has formed, independent of the Concord, dedicated to intervention, defense, and consequences of our own choosing. You declare war? Someone shouted from the Vascari tier. No, Rourke said. I declare resolve. In orbit above Typhon 8, the debris still drifted, smoldering in the light of a sun that would one day collapse. But near it now, ships emerged. Terran, Olari, Traci, independent guild crafts, scout frigates, medical cruisers, light lancers tuned to burn fast and strike harder than anything the Concord had fielded in centuries. They came with purpose, not revenge, not justice, action. The stars, once patient, began to burn. The line was not drawn in ink, nor in code, nor even in fire. It was drawn in action. Typhon 8 marked the moment. The silence that followed marked the failure. And the coalition that answered, without permission, marked the future. For the first time in living memory, the Concord was not the galaxy's moral axis. The center had shifted, and everyone felt it. Some called it a fracture. Others, a heresy. The triumvirate labeled it a procedural anomaly. The Cellari called it an echo, a harmonic deviation signaling a new tonal epoch. But in 1,000 marketplaces, on fringe colonies and core worlds alike, it was called something else. Hope. The first mission of the new coalition launched from the Lagrange Gate above Edras Prime, a once neutral system nestled in the astrogas clouds of the Ilian Rift. Once known for its scholar monks and crystalline archives, Edras had long avoided alignment. But after Typhon, it changed its stars. Now, the gate shimmered with the colors of unity, Terran tactical blue beside Olari green, traced with the deep crimson of the Traci Honor Pact. A rotating sculpture of overlapping sigils spun above the gate, etched into gravimetric fields and ion trails, a new banner. The target, an abandoned slave processing outpost on the edge of the Cellari expanse. Left behind by the Zerati 2 decades ago, it had quietly reactivated in recent months, drawing workers and prisoners from nearby fallen worlds. The Concord had flagged it for review. For 16 cycles, they debated jurisdiction. Intel had come not from Earth, but from an Ilkari scout vessel operating under a peacekeeper charter. The message had been short. They're taking children. Again, no Concord votes. No diplomatic backchannel. Just 6 coalition ships and 1 human captain who had watched his own brother die on Typhon. They dropped in silent. The outpost was destroyed in 17 minutes. The Zerati commandant was eliminated during the breach. A captured transmission caught his last words. You shouldn't have come. No survivors among the Zerati. No prisoners taken. One child, pale and silent, pointed at the Terran insignia on a soldier's chest and said, "You were my brother's star." Every slave was evacuated. Every one of them had a home waiting. And for the first time in centuries, the families on the fringe saw a fleet that didn't just orbit. It landed. The balloon pulsed with unstable light. A delegate from the Eurovi choir collapsed mid-chant, overcome by sonic feedback. A fissure briefly opened in the balloon's lattice shell, quickly sealed, but not forgotten. The chamber reeked of nervous atmosphere correctors. Every color flickered just a beat too long. Delegates murmured, hissed, flashed warning tones. Dozens demanded hearings. Others protested the lack of oversight. The triumvirate launched an emergency audit of Concord charter procedures. Legal protocols lit up like flares across 600 systems. But the people, across 1,000 fractured worlds, were watching a different channel. And they were cheering. In the skylanes of Glomir, traders painted their hulls with new sigils. On Tolaris 9, a child sculpted Rourke's likeness from lunar dust. In marketplaces, children wore mock fleet uniforms. On broken moons, where the Concord had promised help for centuries and delivered none, relief finally arrived. In the form of grain, water, and a human medic with a rusted satchel. It wasn't just a fleet. It was a signal that some would no longer wait for permission to do what was right. In the human embassy, Rourke stood before a new message board. It was analog, by choice. A wall of hand-pinned notes, printouts, small tokens from planets across the fringe. Some were barely readable. Others bore no translation. One was a child's drawing, 4 stick figures and a ship with the words, "They came for us." Above it, in thick charcoal ink, "We see you." Ambassador Nils stepped beside him. "You're building a myth, Elias." Rourke didn't turn. Not a myth. A line. One they'll try to erase. They can try. Ceres appeared at his shoulder, her form shadowed in this room's deliberately dim light. The triumvirate has proposed a formal debate. They want to challenge the legality of the coalition before the High Tribunal. They're invoking the precautionary sovereignty clause. The one last used to bar the Polari reclaimers? Nils asked. Yes, Ceres said. And that ended in fire. Rourke said nothing for a long moment. Then, let them. He finally turned, eyes cold but clear. We'll show them what legitimacy looks like when it's earned. And if they move beyond words? Nils asked. Rourke reached to the board, removed a child's bracelet. Worn. Frayed. Then they'll find out what resolve tastes like. Above Concord Prime, in the deep shadow of the observation decks, a small craft approached with no transponder, no flight plan, no registry. It bore no weapons. Only a single passenger. Senator Lyora. She arrived cloaked in light and silence. No escort. No declaration. Just presence. Return not to speak, but to listen. She stepped onto the bloom alone, and every delegate felt her arrival as if a tuning fork had struck the very air. The chamber lights dimmed to honor pitch. The resonance field adjusted itself without command, shifting the light to a rare hue reserved for ancient testimony, a deep silver violet that hadn't filled the chamber since the Clavari Redemption Accord. The emotional resonance chamber registered harmonic alignment, a signal the chamber had not seen in 5 centuries. In the silence that followed her arrival, the Senate understood. The line had not been drawn by the humans alone. It had been drawn by everyone who still remembered what the Concord was supposed to be. And that line would not be crossed without consequence. The High Tribunal chamber did not echo. It swallowed sound, by design, by history. Originally constructed during the aftermath of the Parallax Wars, the chamber was designed to prevent persuasion by force of tone or volume. Debate here would not echo or inspire, it would dissect. No voice rose above another here. No passion carried through inertia. Only clarity. Only judgment. The air felt dense, ionized, like something vast and unseen was pressing down on every breath. The floor was a single, seamless disk of obsidian-grown memory crystal, capable of capturing and replaying every vibration that passed across it. The walls were alive with adjudicatory telemetry, scanning tone, posture, truth probability. It was not a room built for justice. It was a room built for verdict. Rourke stood beneath the obsidian spire of Concord Law, facing the triumvirate. Node 1 pulsed a colorless light. You are here to answer for the breach of Concord Code, for violating the Sovereignty Charter, for forming a militarized coalition without formal recognition. Rourke didn't blink. I'm here to explain why the law failed, and why we won't fail with it again. Node 4 shifted patterns. You've set a precedent for galactic fragmentation. I've exposed the one you already allowed to rot. Around him, the amphitheater's tiers filled with delegates, observers, legal tacticians from every major faction. The Solari sphere pulsed from the upper balcony, its soft harmonic hum tuned to caution. The Ylkari sat in quiet harmonic sync, Lyora flanked by 2 elder advisors whose robes bore the violet of remembered grief. Neutral systems watched with their own memories, of loss, of delays, of help that never came. Tell me, Rourke said, how many petitions were filed during the first ether famine? Node 7, 3,000. The chamber flickered. Lights dimmed. A delegate from the Ural Ascendancy shifted uncomfortably, its fractal body folding in on itself. The triumvirate's telemetry walls hesitated for a fraction of a second, a glitch that felt like shame. How many enacted? 17. A murmur spread like static. Even the data-bonded beings flinched. A delegation from the Brenhal Compact, long silent, flashed morning tones. We waited. We watched. We obeyed. Rourke said, his voice steady. And in the gaps between your legal calibrations, people died. Children starved on processed ration derivatives because the trade language couldn't define urgency fast enough. Node 1. And what would you have us become? Vigilantes? No, Rourke said. Leaders. Outside the tribunal, protests rose in waves. Holographic banners stretched between orbital platforms, bearing messages in every known tongue. No more typhons. Act or step aside. Rescue is not rebellion. The Eurovi choir broadcast layered harmonics into open space, the sonic equivalent of a cry for justice. The Brennhal constructed a living sculpture of glass thread vines around their transport's hull, a signal of rebirth and defiance. Even the conservative Caldor blinked solidarity in their radiant plume coats. In the lower docks, ships from the coalition stood ready, not as a threat, but as a reminder. They weren't positioned for assault. They were aligned for deployment, to places the Concord had deemed pending deliberation. A child in the crowd held a recording sphere that replayed the outpost liberation, silent, looped, reverent. Others projected symbols onto passing clouds, the overlapping sigils of unity. The new banner. The tribunal watched it too. Node 4. You do not seek to abolish the Concord. No, Rourke said. I seek to remind it. You walk the line of sedition. No, I redraw it. You claim moral superiority. No, Rourke said. I claim responsibility. The chamber quieted. The resonance crystal beneath his boots flared briefly, not from anger or deception, but from intent. Node 1. This body was not designed to move swiftly. Then redesign it, Rourke said. Or stand aside and let those who can act do so. For the first time, Node 4 dimmed without transitioning. Across the chamber, several delegates blinked alert codes to their aides. The Bloom's resonance field shifted to a muted amber, an emotional signature rarely seen, apprehension. The tribunal had been challenged before, but this time it trembled. After 7 hours of challenge, the ruling came not in verdict, but in pause. Node 1. This body will recess to deliberate. You may return tomorrow. But the chamber did not empty. The delegates remained. Some whispered. Some glowed. Some sat perfectly still. But none departed. Because this wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a testament. Rourke stepped down from the floor, past Lyora in the gallery. She bowed her head, slight, measured. She did not speak. She did not need to. He continued walking until he reached the outer corridor, where atmosphere screens shimmered with encrypted crowd noise. Nils waited for him by the central pillar. Ceres hovered nearby, silent. You've pushed them, Nils said. Good, Rourke replied. Let's see if they bend or break. Outside, the stars waited. But so did something else. 1,000 systems. 1,000 questions. And a line that had not moved, only grown sharper. It began not with fleets, but with choices. The tribunal recessed, but the galaxy did not. While Concord debated precedent, the coalition moved. Relief fleets departed to the burnt colonies of the Vescari Drift. Medical drones dropped into toxic atmosphere settlements where the Concord had once sent surveys and never returned. Entire worlds long abandoned to bureaucracy saw their first aid in generations, not from the center, but from the edges. Every action broadcast, not with fanfare, but with presence. The message was no longer whispered. It was lived. The tipping point came at Dathry's Reach, a zone of contested mining moons orbiting a pulsar star near the Cellari border. Dathari had long existed in legal limbo. Once a prosperous cluster of mineral-rich planetoids, it supplied raw exotics during the early expansion era and hosted a joint Concord-Zarati research station, abandoned after the Treaty of Silent Spheres. It was reclaimed in ink, but never in presence. And the Zarati knew it. It wasn't an invasion. It was a calculation. A cruiser entered the Reach without notice. It didn't fire. It didn't land. It simply parked its mass over the largest mining moon and powered up atmospheric scrapers. A dare. The Concord issued a notice. A request. A scheduled review. The coalition didn't. They responded. A Terran vessel dropped into Rhea space with Trasai warwings on its flanks and Cellari shield craft in tow. The lead human ship, Resolute Dawn, was a second-generation cruiser class built in Earth's dry dock yards, reinforced with Olari alloy mesh and Cellari resonance armor. Every line of it said, not negotiation presence. The comms open to all. Vacate Dathari space within 6 minutes. This is not a threat. This is a correction. The Zerati hesitated, and the galaxy watched. 6 minutes passed. The Zerati did not move. One of their hell signs blinked a coded reply. Concord has no standing. They had gambled on inaction, on precedent, on the galaxy blinking first. The coalition did. The Catalyst War began not with conquest, but removal. Surgical. Focused. Every ship tagged in the Dat-Hari incursion was dismantled mid-orbit. Cellari pulse nets folded around command cores, disrupting coordination at the subneural level. Traci blades cut through engine rings with precision strikes measured to the nanosecond. No casualties. No wreckage scattered. Every strike designed to end without escalation. When it was over, Resolute Dawn transmitted one final message. We are done waiting. Across the stars, fractures became factions. Some systems declared alignment with the coalition outright. Others remained in the Concord, but opened diplomatic pacts with the new movement. Border zones that once crackled with tension now lit up with new banners, hybrid sigils that merged cultural markers, Cellari spiral song glyphs, Traci honor streaks, Terran division crests, and a shared emblem, 3 overlapping lines. Worn as cloth, inked on armor, projected into orbit. Not just a symbol of allegiance, but one of shared defiance. Not parallel, but intersecting. Unity through collision. Trade route shifted. Old bastions of neutrality, like Edra's Prime and Coral Station, began hosting joint patrols. Defense platforms were repainted. Aid beacons no longer routed requests to the tribunal. They pinged the coalition first, and got answers. In the tribunal chamber, the deliberation ended with a statement, not a ruling. The Concord acknowledges that sovereignty may be shared, but not surrendered. Rourke read the words on a secure diplomatic line aboard Resolute Dawn, now stationed above a drifting refugee flotilla at the edge of the Kolthani Ring. He said nothing. He didn't need to, because he had already seen what came next. The Catalyst War had no front lines, just choices. In refugee zones, it looked like food dropped from ships without flags. In blockade regions, it looked like medics arriving faster than permission. On war-torn moons, it looked like construction drones deploying before news coverage. In archives, it looked like updated history entries, not from Central Concord terminals, but from local planetary networks reporting what actually happened. In time, it would look like stars joined not by conquest, but by cause. Not by mandate, but momentum. By ships that came not with declarations, but with hands outstretched. By systems that chose unity not out of fear, but memory. The tribunal hadn't lost its place. It still stood, still deliberated, still echoed with the weight of centuries. But that place no longer defined the center. It had been surpassed. The line Rourke drew wasn't mapped in treaties or burned across battlefields. It lived in moments, in the decisions of people who had stopped asking for permission. That line traced through refugee camps, through makeshift clinics, through freighters filled with grain and coded kindness. It passed from one soul to another, carried not as a weapon but as a memory. One act at a time. One decision. A captain who refused to wait for clearance, but flew anyway. A medic who ignored the blockade and treated the wounded beneath collapsing skies. A farmer who shared soil and seed with strangers who no longer felt foreign. A world that remembered its dignity, not as something gifted, but as something reclaimed. And when it was all said and done, when the ships moved on, when the banners faded, when the names were lost, the war would not be remembered for its battles, but for what it built. Until the war had no name left to give it. Only hope.